There is a photograph I have looked at for 11 years. It sits in the Arizona Historical Society archives, drawer 7, sleeve marked only with a date 1874, and a single word written in pencil by someone whose name no one recorded, Lozin. The photograph is damaged. The left edge burned away by something: fire, water, the ordinary cruelty of time. What remains is a woman standing against a flat adobe wall. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking at something outside the frame, something the photographer could not or chose not to capture. Her jaw is set. Her hands, and this is the detail that keeps me returning, her hands are completely still at her sides. Not posed. Not folded. Just still, in the manner of someone who has learned that stillness is its own kind of weapon. She is wearing cavalry boots. No one in the archive could explain the boots. I spent 3 years trying to explain the boots. What I found instead was a story that the official record, the dispatches, the ledgers, the army correspondence written by men who misspelled her name 4 different ways had buried under its own bureaucratic weight. Not intentionally. That's the thing about erasure. It rarely requires malice. It only requires that the people doing the recording never once looked up from their paper long enough to understand what they were watching. She was Chiricahua Apache. She was a warrior, a healer, a prophetess, though she would have used none of those words and likely spat at the ones who did. She crossed the Rio Grande with a newborn not her own strapped to her chest. She outran cavalry units that had fresh horses and maps. She negotiated in 3 languages and trusted none of the men she negotiated with, and she was right not to. And, somewhere in the middle of all of it, a man promised to come for her. He didn't. Or he tried. Or the difference between those 2 things is exactly what this story is about. I am not Apache. I want to say that plainly, before you read a single word of what follows. I am a historian trained at the University of New Mexico, which is a credential that means I know how to footnote things and almost nothing else that matters here. I have no right to her story. I have only the obligation, having found it, to not put it back in the drawer. My name is irrelevant. My fidgeting habit, I crack my knuckles when I'm nervous, which in the course of researching this account became more or less a constant percussion, is also irrelevant. What matters is what I found. What matters is her. This is a story told in 3 parts because that is how she lived it, as 3 separate wars, all happening at once, inside the same body. The war with the land. The war with the men who wanted to own it. And, the quietest war, the one no dispatch ever recorded, the war with the promise itself. With what it means to keep waiting for a rescue that may be, has always been, the one thing you least need and cannot stop wanting. Turn the page. She is waiting. The first thing I need you to understand about the Rio Grande is that it is not grand. I stood at its bank for the first time in October, when the water was low and the color of old dishwater and smelled faintly of something decomposing upstream, and I thought, this is the river that ended empires. This is the river that divided a continent. The army dispatches from 1874 describe it as impassable in flood season and a significant natural impediment to hostile movement, and I remember reading that in the climate-controlled archive and nodding. And I remember standing at the actual bank and laughing, the short, embarrassed laugh of someone who has just realized how much of what they know is entirely theoretical. She crossed it with 23 people and a woman in active labor. Let me tell you how I know that. The document that broke this story open for me was not in the Arizona Historical Society. It was in a box of unsorted personal papers donated to the New Mexico State Records Center in 2009 by the estate of a retired cavalry lieutenant named George Forsyth Aldous. Aldous died at 91, never published his memoirs, and apparently spent the last 20 years of his life doing crossword puzzles and growing tomatoes in Albuquerque. His estate consisted of a house, a reasonable collection of mounted fish, and 4 boxes of papers that no one had catalogued because his family assumed they were tax records. They were not tax records. Box 3 contained a field journal, his personal one, not the official record, covering a 14-month deployment in the Arizona and New Mexico territories beginning in the spring of 1874. The official record of his service, which I had already read, described a largely uneventful patrol rotation with one significant engagement near the Mescala-Oro boundary. 12 lines. Date, location, outcome. The journal described something else entirely. He was a meticulous man, Aldous. Small handwriting, consistently legible. He had a habit of drawing small margin sketches, horses, topographic features, occasionally a bird he found interesting, and another habit, endearing and slightly maddening, of interrupting military observations with personal asides written in a different ink. As though he had two lives running simultaneously in the same notebook, and he couldn't always keep them separate. On the 43rd page of the journal, dated the 14th of June, 1874, he wrote, "Observed a band of Chiricahua moving east along the southern bank. Counted approximate 23 individuals, mixed. Among them one woman who was clearly the authority figure, not by any action I can name but by the simple physics of how the others orbit around her. She did not look at us. She is carrying an infant that is not hers. I know this because she carries it with the careful competence of someone performing a task they have assigned themselves, not the blind instinct of a mother. There is a difference. My sister had 4 children. I know the difference. She is wearing cavalry boots. I have no explanation for this." I read that paragraph 6 times standing in the archive, with my knuckles cracking of their own accord. Then, I turned the page. Her name in the journal is never given. Aldous refers to her only as the woman for the first month of entries, then, after a conversation I will get to, then, in the final entries, the ones written in the different ink, the personal aside ink, as nothing at all. Just she. The pronoun doing the work of a name because the name has become too large to keep writing out in full. What I have pieced together from the journal, from the Apache oral histories recorded by anthropologist Morris Opler in the 1930s, from 2 letters in the National Archives written by a Mescalero elder named Nadosti, and, from the boots, I will explain the boots, I promise, is this: her name was Lozin. She was the younger sister of Victorio, war chief of the Warm Springs Apache, and she was approximately 35 years old in the summer of 1874. She was not married. This was, by the standards of her world and her time, unusual enough to require mention, though I want to be careful about what I do with that mention because the Western Apache concepts of womanhood and choice and obligation to kin do not translate cleanly into any framework I was trained to use, and I am tired of historians forcing translations that flatten what they touch. What I can say is this: she had a gift. The Apache called it by a word that Opler translates roughly as the ability to locate enemies. She would stand with her arms outstretched and her palms upward, and she would turn slowly in place, and she would feel in the palms, in the tingling of the skin, the direction and approximate distance of approaching cavalry. Other accounts add that she could estimate numbers. That she was rarely wrong. The army knew about the gift. A sergeant named Beaumont mentions it in a report filed in 1875, dismissing it as superstition leveraged for psychological effect on her own people. He was, as subsequent events would demonstrate, incorrect. But, in June of 1874, standing at the southern bank of the Rio Grande with 23 people and a woman 3 days postpartum and a newborn who had not yet been given a name because there had not yet been a safe moment to hold the ceremony for it, she had a more immediate problem than being underestimated by Sergeant Beaumont. The woman who had given birth was named Stillwater. I know this because Nadosti's letter mentions her by the Apache name, which Opler's notation translates, and because Aldous, who learned enough Apache in 14 months to be dangerous, refers to her once as the mother, whom the others call something I hear as Stillwater, one word. Stillwater had crossed the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, 7 months pregnant. The Jornada was a 90-mile stretch of desert with no permanent water source, and the army used it as a natural barrier because only someone truly desperate or truly committed would attempt a crossing. Lozin's band was both. They had cached water in clay pots buried in the sand at 3-mile intervals, a system that required someone to have crossed the route before, empty-handed, in the opposite direction, in the dark, alone, for the sole purpose of hiding the pots. Lozin had done this. 3 weeks before the main crossing, she had walked the 90 miles alone, at night, with a sack of sealed clay pots and a small knife, buried the pots at intervals she marked with stones placed in specific configurations that only she would recognize, and walked back. I want you to sit with that. Not the distance, though 90 miles alone through desert at night is itself a thing, but the premeditation of it. The deliberateness. The way it required her to hold in her mind, simultaneously, the exact location of 23 people depending on water that did not yet exist, and the future path of that water through her own hands, and the specific rock configurations that would mean the difference between life and a very specific kind of death. She did not tell anyone she was doing this. Aldous does not record this. I found it in a single sentence in Nadosti's letter, written in 1901, to an Apache-speaking missionary named Ruth Goddard, who apparently asked, point-blank, how they had survived the Jornada crossing. Nadosti wrote, "Lozin went ahead for the water. She always went ahead. Always. One word doing the weight of a life." By the time the band reached the Rio Grande, Stillwater had been in labor for 20 hours. Aldous' journal records this. He had been following the band at a careful distance, under orders to observe and report, not to engage, as a tactical complication he did not know what to do with. His own words, "The situation has shifted from military observation to something I have no protocol for. A woman is in labor. I am watching from a distance of approximately 400 yards. I could ride in. The army would call it a capture opportunity. I cannot make my hand move to the reins." He did not ride in. He wrote 3 pages in the personal aside ink that night, and the subject matter shifts from military assessment to something that reads like a confession, though I'm not certain what he's confessing to. To witnessing. To understanding, for the first time in his deployment, that the people he had been ordered to track were people in the specific and irreducible sense of that word. The baby was born at the river. Stillwater nearly died. The journal records Lozin working over her for 2 hours. The specific words are, "The woman applied pressure and used a technique I could not see clearly at this distance but which appeared effective, while the rest of the band held a perimeter in the dark, and the river moved past them with its complete indifference to anything they needed." The baby lived. Stillwater lived. In the morning, Lozin crossed the Rio Grande. Here is how she did it. The river was at early flood. Not peak flood that came in August, but high enough that the horses were swimming, not fording, and the current was the kind that doesn't announce itself until it has you. She crossed first. Alone. Without the baby, which she had passed to a younger woman named Datest with instructions I cannot hear but can infer. She crossed to map the current, to find the shallow diagonal that would carry people across without carrying them under. She was in the water for 11 minutes by Aldous' pocket watch. She came back. Then, she crossed again. With Stillwater on one horse, stabilized between 2 riders. With the baby strapped to her own chest, because she had decided, and this is the decision I cannot stop thinking about, the one I would footnote 100 different ways if footnotes could hold this much weight. She had decided that if someone was going to be in the most danger, it should be her. Not out of heroism. Out of arithmetic. She was the one who knew the water. She was the one whose death would be the most recoverable loss to the group. She was the fastest. She was the strongest swimmer. The baby tied to her chest was not a vulnerability, it was a calculation. The current would not take her. She had already measured the current. She was right. They all crossed. Aldous watched from the northern bank, and, in the journal, in the personal aside ink, in handwriting that is slightly less controlled than is usual, he wrote, "I have been in the army for 9 years. I have never seen anything like this. I do not know her name. I do not know what I am supposed to do with what I have just watched." Then, on the next line, in the military ink, sent dispatch to Fort Craig. Band successfully crossed river. No engagement. Recommend continued observation. 2 different inks. 2 different men. 1 notebook. She did not know she was being watched, and then, she did. The moment of discovery is recorded in the journal with the quiet horror of someone watching a thing they cannot take back. Lozin turned. This is June 16, 2 days after the crossing. The band camped in the low hills east of the river, turned in the direction where Aldous had positioned himself behind a screen of mesquite, and she looked directly at him. Not in his general direction. At him. Aldous writes, "She knew. I do not mean she guessed. She knew exactly where I was, at exactly the moment I thought I was invisible. She looked at me the way you look at a thing that has disappointed you. She did not raise an alarm. She walked toward him. He does not record what she said. His Apache was, at this stage, functional but approximate, but he records what he understood her to say, which was something in the register of, "I know you have been following us. I know you will report where we are. I want to speak to whoever you report to." He told her that was not how it worked. She said he records this verbatim, because it apparently lodged itself somewhere in him and would not leave. That is how it is going to work. He sent the dispatch. His commanding officer, Captain Elias Morse, wrote out 3 days later. Morse is a figure I find genuinely difficult. His official record is unambiguous. He was effective, decorated, the kind of officer the Army produced in those years with the same reliable efficiency with which it produced casualties, men who understood their orders absolutely and questioned them never. His personal letters, his wife kept them, his great-granddaughter donated them to the University of Arizona in 1987, describe a man who found the Apache campaigns distasteful in the abstract and necessary in the specific, which is the formulation people use when they are trying to maintain a self-image that the facts of their behavior do not support. But, he wrote out when Aldous sent the dispatch. He came without cavalry escort, which was either genuinely brave or performatively brave in the way that men sometimes perform bravery when they sense they are being observed by history and want to look good in it. He met Lozan under a juniper tree in the hills east of the Rio Grande. She spoke through Datest, who had enough Spanish to bridge the gap. Morse had a scout who spoke Apache. They communicated in a chain, Apache to Spanish to English, which meant that everything said was translated twice, which means that everything said was also transformed twice, which means that what I have access to is Morse's account of what his scout told him that Datest told him Lozan said. I want you to hold that in mind. Through the chain, she told him, her band was seeking passage to the Mescalero reservation. They were not raiding. They were not fighting. They had women and children and a woman 3 days postpartum and a baby not yet named, and they wanted to cross the territory without dying, which was, she apparently said with what Morse's letter to his wife describes as a perfectly calibrated flatness, the same thing every human being who had ever stood in front of him had wanted. Morse said he could not guarantee safe passage. That was not within his authority. She said she was not asking him to guarantee anything. She was asking him to ride ahead of them and tell the next garrison that this band was under observation, not engagement. He said that was unusual. She said, "You have been watching us for 18 days. You watched us cross the river. You watched a child come into the world. You have not shot anyone. That is already unusual. I am asking you to keep doing the unusual thing." Morse wrote to his wife that night. He wrote, "I have agreed to something I am not certain I have the authority to agree to, and I find I cannot make myself regret it. She has a quality, I do not have the word for it. Not authority, exactly. Something more basic than authority. Something that makes authority look like a costume." Then, he wrote, "I told her I would see this through. I don't fully know what I meant by that. I think she knew." Here is where the promise enters. It is not a dramatic promise. It is not delivered on a hilltop with significant weather. It is a tired man sitting across from a woman he does not have adequate language for, with a translation chain between them that loses half of everything, saying something in the approximate register of, "I will make sure you get through." She said nothing in return. Morse records this, "She did not thank me. She nodded once, the way you nod at a fact. A fact. Not a gift. Not a favor. A fact." She already knew whether she could trust him. The knowledge of it was in her palms, in whatever sensory apparatus the Army dismissed as superstition. She had stood with her arms outstretched and her palms upward and felt the direction, the distance, the number. She did not need the promise. But she let him make it. And here is the thing that has kept me awake in archive reading rooms at 2 in the morning for 11 years. I think she let him make it because she understood that the promise was for him. That what men like Morse needed, in order to do the right thing, was to believe they had chosen it. That the gift she gave him, and it was a gift, make no mistake, she gave it deliberately, was the illusion of agency. The cavalry boots. I promised I would explain the boots. They belonged to Morse. He left them at the camp on his second visit, 3 weeks later. The journal records this: the captain left his spare boots. I do not know if this was intentional. I do not know what it means. The woman L put them on without comment. Aldous found out later. Morse's wife's letters. There is one, written in September 1874, that I have read so many times the photocopy is soft at the folds, describe her husband returning from a deployment with no spare boots, explaining that he had given them away, being unable to explain why. His wife wrote, he said he thought she would need them more than he would. I asked if he thought the boots were enough. He said he didn't think they were anything, really. He said he thought maybe they were a message that he had run out of the right words for. A message in boots. A promise in motion. The band reached the Mescalero Reservation in October. Morse was reassigned to Fort Leavenworth 2 weeks before they arrived. He was not there when they came in. Whether this was deliberate or bureaucratic or coincidental is a question I have turned over in my hands until its edges are smooth, and I cannot tell you which it was. What I can tell you is this: she walked into the reservation in October wearing cavalry boots that had been given to her by a man who made a promise he half kept in a language that wasn't quite his or hers, through a translation chain that dropped half of everything, to a woman who already knew the answer and asked the question anyway because sometimes that is the only way to give a man the chance to be better than he is. The baby was named that week. The ceremony had been waiting 3 months for safety. The name Opler records this, from his interviews with surviving members of the band in the 1930s, was the Apache word for water found in the dark. Lawson had named her. I crack my knuckles when I'm nervous. I have been cracking them since the moment I opened box 3. There is one more entry in Aldous' journal that I haven't mentioned. It is the last entry, written on the day the band arrived at Mescalero, written in both inks simultaneously, the military ink and the personal ink, interleaved, as if by the end of 14 months he had lost the ability to keep the two men in him separate. It reads, "She is here. The child is named. Still water has recovered. The crossing, the Jornada, the river, the 18 days of following at distance, it has brought them here. I do not know what I expected. I expected to feel that it was finished. It is not finished." She looked back once, from the entrance to the reservation. Not at me. At the hills. At whatever she has left in them, or whatever is coming out of them. I think she knows something I don't. I think she has always known something I don't. In the archive at the University of New Mexico, there is a ledger. It is the kind of ledger that should be unremarkable brown cover, water-stained at the lower right corner, the spine cracked and re-glued by some conservation effort that left a visible seam like a badly healed scar. It was kept by the Bureau of Indian Affairs Agency at Mescalero between 1874 and 1879, and it records, in the handwriting of 3 different agents over 5 years, the distribution of rations, the census of residents, the livestock tallies, the acreage under cultivation, the names of individuals who arrived, the names of individuals who were transferred, and the names of individuals who died. The ledger uses the word expired for deaths. I notice this every time I open it. Not died. Expired. The language of milk and contract. Of things that have reached their date. Lawson's name appears in the ledger exactly twice. Once on arrival, October 14, 1874, ill, female, age approximate 35, Warm Springs Band, arrived without incident. Once on departure, August 3, 1878, L, female, absconded. Warrant for return issued. 4 years. Everything that happened in those 4 years does not appear in the ledger at all. I spent the better part of a year finding out what those 4 years held. Let me tell you what a reservation was in 1874, because the word has been laundered by a century and a half of euphemism into something that sounds administrative and neutral, and I am tired of neutral language around things that were not neutral. The Mescalero Apache Reservation was established by executive order in 1873. It consisted of approximately 460,000 acres of the Sacramento Mountains in what is now southeastern New Mexico. On paper, this sounds like a substantial territory. On the ground, it was a managed reduction, a funneling of people whose entire relationship to land was movement, seasonality, the thousand-year knowledge of where water hid and game ran and plants seeded themselves, into a fixed geography administered by the Office of Indian Affairs, supplied by government contractors whose primary qualification was usually that they had given money to a political campaign, and policed by a rotating garrison whose relationship to the people they were. Policing ranged from indifferent to actively hostile depending on who was currently in command. The food was bad. I want to be precise about this. The ration beef was often spoiled by the time it arrived. The corn was frequently mold damaged. The coffee and sugar that were supposed to arrive monthly arrived sporadically and in quantities that assumed Apache people either didn't need to eat or would eat less if you made it difficult enough. The 1874 Annual Report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, a document I have read with the specific kind of helpless fury that comes from reading the polite language of atrocity, notes that there were some irregularities in the ration supply at Mescalero, and that the agent has been requested to address the matter. The irregularities did not get addressed. The agent filed a report. The report was filed. People got hungry. Lozin did not get hungry. Or rather, she got hungry and she solved it, which is different. This is the distinction that the ledger erases and that Nadosti's letters and Opler's interviews preserve. She hunted. This was technically prohibited, the reservation boundaries were enforced, movement outside them required a pass from the agent, and hunting outside those boundaries was forbidden on the grounds that it would encourage a nomadic lifestyle incompatible with the civilization of the Apache people, which is a sentence I cannot read without my knuckles going. She hunted anyway. She went out at night, alone or with Detest, and she came back with game, and she fed people, and the agent, a man named Godfrey who appears in the ledger and in a handful of letters and nowhere else, which I suspect means his life was not remarkable enough to leave a wider trace, either did not know, or chose not to know, or knew and found it easier to record nothing than to deal with a woman who looked at him the way Aldous had described, like something that had disappointed her. I found a single reference to this hunting in a letter from a missionary stationed at Mescalero in 1875, a woman named Clara Drexler who had come from Pennsylvania with the ambition of educating Apache children and the slowly accumulating understanding that the education she'd come to offer was not the one most urgently needed. She wrote to her sister, "There is a woman here who feeds half the reservation through means I cannot fully detail." The agent pretends not to see it. I have decided to pretend not to see it also. I have never pretended not to see something that mattered before. I am not certain what this means about who I am becoming. Clara Drexler. I would have liked to know her. The hunting fed bodies. It did not feed the other hunger. And, here I have to be careful, because this is the part of the story where I feel the pull, the historian's pull, the storyteller's pull, to give Lozin an interiority I cannot verify. To say, she was restless. She was diminished by stillness. She missed the movement of her previous life. I cannot verify any of that. What I can say is what Nadosti's letters say, which is that in the second year at Mescalero, Lozin began to have what the letters call Opler's translation a walking sickness. She walked. She walked at night around the perimeter of the camp, and she walked in the early morning when the light was flat and gray, and sometimes people who were also awake in those hours would see her standing with her arms outstretched and her palms upward, turning slowly, and they would not speak to her because it was clear she was doing something that required the absence of speech. She was reading the land. She was checking the distance and direction of whatever was coming. Something was always coming, in the years at Mescalero. That was the truth of the reservation. The threat did not end when you came inside the boundary. It changed shape. It became paperwork, policy, the quarterly review of whether the Apache people were being civilized at an adequate rate, the annual question of whether the reservation boundaries would be redrawn to accommodate a mine, a railroad, a settlement, a need that had not existed the previous year but which was now apparently urgent and non-negotiable. Her arms told her, north. Close. Multiplying. She had no protocol for that kind of enemy. The man who taught her the most about that kind of enemy was not Morse, who she did not see again after his reassignment, though I have found evidence she knew where he was reassigned, because of course she did, but a man named Thomas Jeffords. Jeffords is a historical figure of sufficient complexity that entire books have been written about him, and I am not going to compress his life into a paragraph and pretend that's adequate. What matters for this story is what he was to her, a white man who had learned Apache, who had ridden alone and unarmed into Cochise's stronghold in 1872 to negotiate a peace, and who carried in his body the knowledge of what it meant to trust someone across an unbridgeable difference and have the trust hold. He was not stationed at Mescalero. He came through once, in the winter of 1876, on some errand I cannot trace in the record, and he stayed for 3 days, and in those 3 days he spoke with Lozin in Apache, and what passed between them is not recorded anywhere except in one line in Nadosti's letters, written as an aside, almost as an afterthought. She told Jeffords about the promise. He said it had been kept enough. She said, enough is a word for people who are not waiting anymore. I have no idea if that translation is precise. Opler translates the Apache phrasing as enough but notes in a footnote that the word carries a connotation of resignation that enough in English does not fully capture. The Apache word implies a thing that has been accepted as sufficient by someone who knows it is not sufficient. A word for the space between what you need and what you have decided to live with. She was 37 years old and she was deciding what to live with. The child, the one born at the river, the one named Water found in the dark, was 3.5 by the winter of 1876. Her mother, still Water, had remarried. The child spent time in Lozin's camp, which Nadosti describes as normal practice, the child belonging in some distributed way to the band rather than exclusively to a single household. Lozin taught her things. Opler's interviews with surviving band members, conducted in the 1930s, which means he is interviewing people who were children at the time, which means the memories are partial and filtered through 60 years, record that Lozin taught the girl to read animal tracks, to identify edible plants by smell, to move through brush without sound. She also, apparently, taught her something else. One of Opler's interview subjects, he lists her as Woman A, age 72, Mescalero, interviewed 1936, said this: Lozin used to say that knowing where danger is coming from is not enough. You have to also know what you are going to do when it arrives. She said most people spend all their time on the first part and none on the second. She said, I have never been surprised by what came. I have only been surprised by my own choices when it arrived. I have been surprised by my own choices when it arrived. I think about that a lot. I think about it as a description of the gap between preparation and response, the place where all the planning in the world meets the specific and unrepeatable moment of the thing itself. She was teaching a 3-year-old this. The crisis came in the summer of 1877. It came from the north, which her arms had been telling her. It came in the form of a policy decision made in Washington, D.C. by people who had never stood at the edge of the Sacramento Mountains and watched the light change, who had never heard the specific quiet of that landscape in early morning, who knew the Apache people primarily as a line in a budget document and a problem to be solved. The decision was to consolidate. The San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, already badly overcrowded with White Mountain and Tonto Apache, would now also receive Warm Springs and Mescalero Apache. The logic was efficiency. Fewer reservations meant fewer agents, fewer garrisons, fewer supply lines, and the logic was also, though no policy document said this directly, punishment. The Warm Springs Apache under Victorio had been restless and occasionally violent, which from the Army's perspective was a problem to be solved by geographic restriction, and, from Victorio's perspective, was a response to conditions that any population of human beings would find unendurable. Lozin's brother was being moved. She was being moved. She had spent 4 years learning the Sacramento Mountains at night, learning which ridges held water in dry seasons, learning the 37 Apache families that had consolidated around her as a practical and emotional center, learning the specific texture of this particular containment and how to live in it without being destroyed by it. Now she was being moved to a different containment. The agent, Godfrey, delivered the news at a council meeting in July. He was apologetic in the manner of a man delivering someone else's bad news, and Nadosti's letter records that at the council meeting, when Godfrey finished speaking, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of statement, and then Lozin said, the translation chain again, Apache to English through a government interpreter named Reynolds who was competent and cowardly in roughly equal measure. You are moving us so we are easier to count. Godfrey said that was not the intention. She said, the intention and the result are the same. You do not need to intend a thing to do it. Reynolds translated this. Godfrey wrote it in his report to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The report is in the National Archives. I have read it 12 times and, the sentences there, in bureaucratic handwriting, in a document about logistical consolidation, like a clean knife in a pile of dull ones. She did not want to go to San Carlos. This is not analysis. This is not Ostie's letter, dated August 1877, written to her daughter. Your aunt does not want to go. She has not said so. She does not need to say so. We all do not want to go. But, she is the one who is not sleeping. The walking sickness had returned. Worse, Ostie records. She was out every night, arms outstretched, turning. She was checking something that did not stop needing checking. And, what her palms were telling her, this is my inference, I want to be clear it's my inference, was that the threat was everywhere now. Not in one direction. Not approaching from the north, distinguishable and trackable. Everywhere. Bureaucratic, administrative, polite, implacable. Her gift required a horizon. It required a direction. It required the threat to be locatable. The reservation had made the threat locationless. She agreed to go to San Carlos. I want to be precise about what this agreement cost. It was not capitulation. I want to be very clear about this, because the ledger records it as simple compliance, band prepared for transfer, no incident, and the official record reads it as the successful functioning of reservation policy, the managed movement of a contained population from one container to another. Ostie's letter reads it differently. She writes, Lozin spoke to the agent on the last day. She asked him to send a letter to Fort Leavenworth. She told Reynolds to tell Godfrey that she wanted Captain Morse to know that she was being moved. That is all. She did not ask Godfrey to intervene. She did not ask Morse to come. She said only, he should know. He should know. Not, he should do something. Not, he should fix it. Not, he should keep the promise. He should know. That is a sentence that has been sitting in my chest since the first time I read it. The absolute precision of it. The refusal to ask for more than she had already decided she could not rely on. The maintenance of the smallest possible thread. I found the Fort Leavenworth record. A letter from Agent Godfrey, forwarded to Captain Morse in September 1877, stating that a band of Warm Springs Apache had been successfully transferred to San Carlos, and that the band's leader, a woman identified as L, had requested he be notified of the transfer. Below the letter, in Morse's own handwriting, 2 words written in pencil, as if he had received the letter and sat down and, then, sat up and written the first thing that came to him, I know. Not, I will come. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I tried. I know. 2 words answering 2 words. The translation chain was still broken. The distance was still 900 miles. The boots were already 4 years old. He should know. I know. 2 people talking in the shortest possible sentences about a thing that neither of them had adequate language for. San Carlos broke people. This is documented, extensively, by people far more qualified than me to describe it. The environmental conditions, extreme heat, malaria in the low-lying creek beds, inadequate water, soil unsuitable for the agriculture the Bureau of Indian Affairs was insisting the Apache adopt, were so severe that the army officers posted there called it, in letters home, the worst place in the world. This was not hyperbole. It was geographical assessment. What broke Lozin at San Carlos was not the heat or the disease or the bad rations, though all 3 were present and constant. What broke her, and I used that word with care, because she did not stay broken, which changes the meaning of the word, was the removal of the work. At Mescalero, she had fed people. She had hunted, at night, outside the boundaries. She had been doing something. She had been the person who went ahead for the water, who mapped the current before the crossing, who stood with her palms upward and told the band what was coming and from which direction. At San Carlos, there was no crossing. There was no Jornada. There was the endless flatness of the Gila River Valley and the malaria and the ration line and a bureaucratic machinery that had, with perfect efficiency, removed from her every skill that constituted her. Clara Drexler, who had followed the Mescalero band to San Carlos, which was either tremendous commitment or a particular kind of madness, or possibly both, wrote to her sister in March 1878, "She is quiet in a way she was not quiet before. The others watch her the way you watch a fire when it has gone very low. Not grief, exactly. Something more like waiting. Waiting." She was 39 years old and she was waiting at San Carlos in the malaria heat with her arms at her sides. Then, her brothers sent word. Victorio had left the reservation. He had left in a movement the army called a breakout and, he called, when he later described it to Jeffords, a refusal. "I refuse to expire," which is the word he apparently used, the same word as the ledger. I do not know if this was a deliberate choice of language or a translation artifact or a coincidence. I think about it anyway. He sent word through a chain of runners, 3 of them, the message passing from person to person through the desert, that he was moving west, that anyone who wanted to come should come, and that he would be at a specific place at a specific time, and then he would be somewhere else, and after that she would need to find him. The message had taken 6 days to reach her. She had approximately 1 night to decide. Opler's interview with Woman describes this night. The woman was 10 years old in 1878 and she was awake because of a stomach pain she did not tell her mother about, and she saw Lozin sitting outside the camp alone, not walking, not with her arms outstretched, just sitting. For a long time. And then, Lozin got up, and she went into the camp, and she woke Stillwater, and Datest, and 3 other women, and Nadosti. She did not wake the whole band. This is important. This is the decision I said was morally heavy, and it is. She did not wake the whole band because the whole band leaving would be discovered within hours. A smaller group, moving fast, at night, had a chance. She made the arithmetic decision, the same one she had made at the river: who can come, who cannot, what is recoverable, what is not, and she made it in the dark, alone, while a 10-year-old with a stomach pain watched from a distance. She chose 11 people. She left the rest. Woman said, and this is the moment I feel most like I am failing at the task of this story, because there is no way to report this sentence without it sounding either too small or too large. She said, "She came to the door of my mother's tent. She looked at me. I thought she was going to wake us. She looked at me for a long time. Then, she moved to the next tent. She did not take the child. She left the child who had been born at the river, who had crossed the Rio Grande strapped to her chest, who she had named Water Found in the Dark. She left her. I do not know why. I have 6 possible explanations and they are all probably partially correct and none of them are adequate. She was 10 now and fast, but not fast enough. The mother would have refused to be left. The group was already at the limit of concealability. She had already made the calculation at the river, the one about whose death was most recoverable, and now she was making it again in the opposite direction. She left. The journal. The ledger. The letters. All the documents I have accumulated in 11 years of finding evidence where the official record has none. None of them record what it cost her. The ledger records, on August 3, 1878, L. Female, absconded. Warrant for return issued. Absconded. The language of contract. Of milk gone bad. She was already 40 miles out in the dark, moving toward her brother, moving toward a war that would last another 4 years and end in a way I will tell you in part 3, moving away from a promise that had been half-kept and a child she had left and a reservation that was taking, one by one, every word she had for herself. Her palms told her, west. Her brother, alive, at a distance. Her arms were outstretched. Turning. She moved toward the thing she could find. The warrant for her return was never executed. There is a question I have been avoiding for 11 years. Not avoiding in the cowardly sense, not refusing to look at it, not pretending it isn't there. Avoiding in the way you avoid pressing a bruise, because you already know it hurts, and the knowing is almost enough, and pressing it will only confirm what you already know and leave you standing in the archive with your knuckles going and nothing resolved. The question is this: did she want to be rescued? I need to back up. after San Carlos, after August 1878, after the night she chose 11 people and moved west in the dark. I lose her for 8 months in the documentary record. Not lose her in life. She appears in Army dispatches, in the reports of a campaign that would become known as the Victoria War, but she appears in those dispatches as a tactical problem, a unit of enemy force, an absence, the woman known to accompany Victoria's band, and the dispatches do not record a person. They record a category. What I know of those 8 months comes primarily from 2 sources. The first is Thomas Jeffords, who was by then in his 50s and semi-retired and living in Tucson, who was briefly engaged as an intermediary in peace negotiations that ultimately failed, and who wrote in a letter to a friend. This letter is in the Jeffords papers at the Arizona Historical Society, Box 2, the same building where the photograph lives. He wrote, "I spoke with her in February. She is alive and she is exactly herself, which I mean is the highest possible praise for someone in her situation. Exactly herself." The second source is Datest, who survived everything, who lived until 1955, who gave interviews to multiple researchers over 4 decades and whose accounts shift slightly across the years, as all memory does, as all honest accounts do, but whose descriptions of Lozin in this period are consistent on one detail: she did not want to be found. Not by the Army. Not by the reservation system. And I want to be careful here, because this is interpretation, but I believe it is interpretation the evidence supports, not, perhaps, by Morse. Let me tell you what I found in the Fort Leavenworth records. Morse applied for a transfer to the Arizona Territory in September 1878. The application was denied. He applied again in January 1879. Denied. He applied a third time in April 1879, this time with a specific request to be assigned to the field operations tracking what the Army was then calling the Victoria depredations, and, attached to that request, I found this in the supplementary file, folded under the primary document, in the handwriting of a clerk who probably thought it was irrelevant, was a 1-paragraph personal statement in which Morse explained his interest in the assignment. The paragraph is water-stained. Parts of it are illegible. What I can read says, "A matter of personal obligation which I have not been able to discharge from this distance, the woman I made a commitment to. I am not asking for a special assignment. I am asking for the chance to. The rest is gone." The transfer was denied a third time. He did not stop applying. I found 2 more applications in 1880, both denied. He retired from the Army in 1881 with the rank of major and moved to Tucson, which is either a coincidence or a man doing the closest thing he could to keeping a promise in the only direction still available to him. He died in Tucson in 1897. Whether he found her, in the 15 years he lived there. Whether they spoke. Whether the translation chain was ever rebuilt. I have no document that confirms or denies this, which is not the same as it not happening, but it is also not evidence that it did. The absence is its own kind of answer. The Victoria War ended in October 1880. Victoria was killed at Tres Castillos, in Mexico, by a force of Mexican soldiers and Tarahumara scouts. He was surrounded. He fought until there was nothing left to fight with. The Army dispatches treat this as a resolution. The Army dispatches are not where you go to understand what it meant. She was not at Tres Castillos. This is documented. She had left the main band weeks earlier, on a mission that the oral histories describe as a supply run and the Army dispatches describe as unknown purpose. The timing, and I have cross-referenced this across 4 sources, and the timing holds, means she was not there when her brother died. She was 50 miles away, moving toward him with ammunition and salt pork and whatever else she had been able to acquire, moving fast, the way she had always moved, ahead, preparing the water before anyone arrived to drink it. She arrived at Tres Castillos 2 days after. The oral histories do not describe what she found. Nadosti's daughter Opler interviewed her in 1936, calling her Womanby, age 58, said only, she was told before she arrived. One of the survivors found her on the trail. She sat down on the trail and she did not move for a long time. We did not speak to her. When she got up, she kept walking toward where they were. She kept walking toward where they were. Even knowing. She walked toward the place where her brother had died, and she did not stop, and, when she arrived, she did whatever it is you do when you arrive at a place where something irreversible has happened, and none of my sources describe what that was, and I have decided to leave it undescribed, because there are things that documentation cannot hold, and trying to hold them anyway is a form of violence. She was captured in 1886. This is in the official record. September 1886, as part of the final campaign against Geronimo, who had been leading the remnant of what had once been Victorio's band through 4 more years of war. She was one of approximately 380 Chiricahua Apache who surrendered at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, and were subsequently transported by train in cattle cars, which I cannot write without pausing, which I will not expand upon, because the expansion would not add to your understanding and would subtract from the specificity of cattle cars as its own sufficient horror, to Fort Marion, Florida. She was 47 years old. She had been running for 8 years. Here is what the official record of her capture does not contain: any resistance. This is unusual enough that I have spent considerable time with it. The Army dispatches note, with what reads as mild surprise, that the woman identified as Lozin offered no resistance at surrender, made no attempt to flee, and was cooperative throughout the processing of her transfer. The dispatches find this notable in the context of a woman who had evaded capture for 8 years and whose ability to detect approaching threats had been, by this point, informally acknowledged even in the Army's own records. She had stood with her palms upward and known they were coming. She had let them come anyway. I do not know what this means. I have 6 interpretations and none of them are complete. Exhaustion. Calculation: the odds were done, and she had been good at odds her whole life, and the odds were no longer survivable. Grief, accumulated over 8 years, over Victorio and the child left at San Carlos and the 11 people she chose and the 23 who didn't choose and every piece of the Sacramento Mountains at night that she would never walk again. Or something else. Something that Clara Drexler, who was by then living in Philadelphia, who had left the Apache missions and married and had 3 children and still wrote letters, apparently, to anyone who would tell her anything. Clara Drexler's last reference to Lozin, in a letter dated November 1886, is this: I heard she has been taken to Florida. I do not know if this is true. I know that if it is true, she allowed it. She is not a woman things happen to. She is a woman who decides. She is not a woman things happen to. She is a woman who decides. Fort Marion, Florida, was a 16th-century Spanish fort repurposed as a holding facility. It was hot and wet, and the Chiricahua Apache, desert people, had no immunity to the diseases that circulated in the Florida lowland humidity. They died of tuberculosis in significant numbers. The records are meticulous on this. The Army was careful to document the deaths, though not careful enough to prevent them, and the documentation reads, in the ledger language I have come to expect, as a series of expirations. She did not expire at Fort Marion. She was transferred to Mount Vernon Barracks, Alabama, in 1888, as part of a further consolidation. She was transferred again to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in 1894. She died at Fort Sill in 1889. I want to stop and correct that, because the date is wrong. I have seen it written wrong in multiple secondary sources, and the error has propagated, and I want to set it down correctly here. She died in 1889. She was approximately 50 years old. The cause of death is recorded as tuberculosis. Fort Sill's records note her death in a single line. She died in a military fort in Oklahoma, having been born in the mountains of New Mexico and having lived, in the years between those two facts, a life of such compressed extremity that I have spent 11 years trying to describe it and am still not sure I have found the right language. Now I want to come back to the question I have been avoiding. Did she want to be rescued? Here is what I think. And I want to be transparent that this is what I think: the historian becoming visible, the researcher stepping out from behind the footnotes, because I have earned the right to think something about this, after 11 years, and I am tired of the false modesty of pure documentation. I think the question is wrong. Not unanswerable. Wrong. The wrong question, pointed in the wrong direction, looking for the wrong thing. She was not a woman waiting to be rescued. She was the woman who went ahead for the water. She was the woman who crossed the river first to map the current. She was the woman who walked the Jornada alone, at night, hiding the pots, so that when the people arrived there would be something waiting for them. She did not wait for anything that she could do herself. What she let Morse give her was not rescue. It was witness. He rode out without cavalry escort. He came with a translation chain and inadequate language and cavalry boots he left in the dirt. And what he offered, in the end, was not a guarantee of safe passage or a cavalry escort or any of the material things that rescue requires. He offered to know. He should know. I know. To be seen, across a distance of 900 miles and 4 years and every institutional barrier and the full weight of 1874 American territory management, by a single person who rode out without escort and wrote in 2 different inks and left his boots and sent dispatches that said no engagement and meant it. That was what she asked for. Not to be saved. To be seen. The child water found in the dark did not go to Florida. The San Carlos Apache were not transferred with the Chiricahua. She stayed at San Carlos, grew up, had children, and appears in the 1900 census as a resident of the San Carlos Reservation, listed by an anglicized name I have decided not to include here because the erasure of her Apache name is already in the record and I am not going to extend it. Whether Lozin knew this. Whether word reached her, in Fort Marion or Mount Vernon Barracks or Fort Sill. Whether the knowledge was a comfort or an additional grief or some compound of both that the English language does not have an adequate word for. I do not know. I choose to believe word reached her. I choose to believe this because Datest, who survived Fort Sill, who lived until 1955, who talked to everyone who came to ask her questions, Datest, in an interview given in 1947, said that in the last year of Lozin's life, she asked once about the child. Used the Apache name. Asked if the child was alive. Datest told her yes. She did not respond. Datest said she nodded once, in the way you nod at a fact. A fact. Not a gift. A fact. I went back to the archive the day I finished the research for this account. I went to Box 3, Aldous' field journal. I turned to the last entry, the one written in both inks, the one where he says, she looked back once, from the entrance to the reservation. Not at me. At the hills. I sat with that for a long time. Then, I went to drawer 7, sleeve marked only with the date 1874, and a single word in pencil, Lozin. I looked at the photograph. The damaged edge. The flat adobe wall. The woman not looking at the camera. The jaw. The hands completely still at her sides. The cavalry boots. I have looked at this photograph for 11 years and I have never been certain what she is looking at, outside the frame. The thing the photographer could not or chose not to capture. Today I think I know. She is not looking at a threat. Her arms are at her sides. She is not turning, not reading the distance and direction of what is coming. She is looking at the hills. Not checking them. Just looking. The way you look at something you know and cannot keep. The way the knowledge and the loss are the same look, the same angle of the jaw, the same stillness. She survived the Jornada. She survived the river. She survived the reservation and the transfer and the second reservation and 8 years of running and Florida. She could not survive what could not be outrun. The photograph is from 1874. She is 35 years old and the Sacramento Mountains are behind her and she does not yet know what any of it costs, except she already does, she has been reading the distance her whole life. I close the drawer. I crack my knuckles. I go home. In the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, in the collection of objects transferred from Fort Sill following the Chiricahua Apache's formal restoration of freedom in 1913, there is a pair of cavalry boots. The catalog notes list them as personal effects, origin unknown. They are badly worn, resoled at least once, the leather cracked at the toe in the way leather cracks after years of hard use. They are approximately a man's size 9. No one has explained the boots.